Miller. I'm a member of the Social Sciences Curriculum Committee, and we're delighted to have you with us today for Jack Sheridan's class, The History of the Kalamazoo Harbor, Singapore Area. Jack Sheridan has over 20 years of experience researching, preserving, presenting, and writing history of the Saugatuck Douglas area. He's an archivist of historical photos for the Saugatuck Douglas History Center, and in that role, he has access to thousands of photographs, and you're going to be seeing many of those in his presentation today. His grandfather was a lighthouse keeper at the Kalamazoo Harbor Lighthouse, and it's very fitting for him to be involved, as he is, with history of the Saugatuck Douglas area. So please welcome Jack Sheridan. Go ahead, Jack.
Hi, how many participants do we have today?
We have 67 on right now, Jack.
And there may be some more entering as we go along.
Yep.
Okay. I'm used to giving PowerPoint presentations where all the people are in the same room. So this is a different experience. But the one drawback to the Zoom is it's more difficult for interchange between myself and the people watching. I usually like to keep everything open to questions, and so can simply interrupt me where I am by raising their hand, but that's not going to be possible today. But relaying the questions, the way I've set up the slides, is when most of the slides will be just enter your screen from right to left, left to right, however. But where the topic changes a little bit, then it'll go to fade. So at each one of those spots, I'll stop and see if there's any questions from what I've said previously. And it doesn't have to be. It can be from the beginning of the presentation if you think of something, because I think all these presentations are a lot easier for people if they're able to look at a picture, and then that usually prompts a question. There's no better way to learn history than to look at pictures, which is pretty obvious. That I'm very lucky in that I knew a lot of the history, and I sort of grew up in Saugatuck, but I didn't really start learning the history until I started looking at the pictures. And now I've looked at many thousands of pictures, and I'm able to look at a picture and I automatically know usually a little bit about the picture if it's of any significance. I'm also blessed that I have a photographic memory, meaning I can remember photographs. I can't remember where I put my glasses this morning, but I can remember photographs that were taken 100 years ago or more. And we have somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 photographs in the database at the Saugatuck Historical Society. So I can, every time I look at a photograph, I know whether it's in our database or it's a new one. And oftentimes I can remember details of the photograph. So we'll get started here. There's a lot of photographs. This presentation is oriented around photographs. And most of the photographs have a little caption at the bottom, so that'll give you a clue as to what you're looking at. Oftentimes there's also a year, so that's a big help. Now, going to the heart of Saugatuck presentation. There has been a term thrown around, the wild heart of Saugatuck. I think it should really be just the heart of Saugatuck because it's not all wild, but it is kind of really, if you think of the area, the most important part of the history and the area today really is the area that we're kind of talking about. And that's because the river goes through there. And the river is really kind of the thing that pulls everything together in Saugatuck. The river is the reason the town is so great, the reason that the town has the wonderful history that it has. So what I have done is picked out a relatively small area here that we're going to talk about today. And it's the mouth, the land, the owners, the history. And I've divided it into basically three areas. If you look at this slide on the left, is the new area that is now being developed, and the next area is the area just to the south of that. So you've got north, and then look to the south. You see that circled area, and it's got a little square in it. That is the Saugatuck natural area. The little square is the lighthouse area, which is privately owned by the Dean family. That is the area that this presentation is about, those three areas. So here we go. You can keep in mind that this area, and I will use my cursor to point out various areas that I'm talking about on this map. I don't know how well this one will show up. But besides the three areas that I'm going to talk about today, there are some areas that are important that you understand. A lot of you know where they are. Some of you people that aren't that familiar with the area are maybe know of some of them. To the top is the Saugatuck Dune State Park, which is really a great area and extends to the north and goes toward Holland quite a ways. Then the area below that is the newly developed North Shore area that is I will talk about today. And you got the Pine Trail Camp area. We've got Saugatuck itself, which is kind of the yellow. The size of the area is there are three parcels. The North Shore is 250 some acres. Saugatuck Harbor is 173 acres. And the lighthouse, which is owned by the Dean family, is 11 acres. What we're going to do first is just do a flyover, and some of it is a flyover taken from an airplane. Some of it is taken from the top of Mount Ballhead, which is a very great perspective point, and some of it's on the bottom. This will just kind of get your feet on the ground as to the beauty of the area. This is looking north. You see the current channel. You can see the North Shore area on the north side of the channel. On the south side of the channel is the Saugatuck natural area. This is taken from Mount Ballhead, and in the fall it looks in the same direction. To the north you can't really see much except parts of the current river and parts of the old river. This is called the Old Harbor, and this is the southern end of the Old Harbor. The Old Harbor was formed when the new cut was put through in 1906, and this curve was taken out of the river. And because the water started flowing through the new cut, the old route became landlocked. And this is the south end, or the oval end. If you look to the lower right, that is the oval beach end. Probably all of you have been, most of you have been there. The lighthouse originally sat right here. There is now the Dean Cottage is built on that. So this area here is owned by the Dean family. It's privately owned. This area here is the Saugatuck Natural Area. This area is Oxbow. Here's an aerial view looking at the thing we just looked at. The lighthouse sat here. Originally the channel went through here, made a loop. And the reason that the channel was changed was it was very difficult for larger vessels to navigate this bend in the river. Another view from the same spot. There's a high dune there that's called the Crow's Nest on top of the dune, and there's hiking trails open to the public that go out to this spot, so you can hike out there and you got a beautiful view. This is the other end, which became landlocked. It used to be open, flowing right through here. And the Kalamazoo River is just 100 yards or so beyond where the photographer was standing. This is the Dean Cottage, which is built on the foundation of the lighthouse. Okay, so getting in a little bit to the history, now you know what it looks like. Take a look at this. The whole thing started in 1830. Michigan was not yet a state, but William Butler and his family, his wife and 2 children, were dropped off and built a raft, pulled it up to where Saugatuck is today. Butler's goal was to establish a trading post and trade with the Indians. In 1834, the land was purchased probably from the federal government, and Singapore was founded by a company called the New York, Michigan Company. In 1835, this same company built a lumber mill and started lumbering operations. 1839, a lighthouse was built. Now, this isn't the lighthouse that you're going to see today because no pictures exist of it. It was a little bit closer to the lake and closer to the river. And in about 20 years, 18 years actually, it collapsed because the footings had been undermined by the river moving. So it was built out of stone, and we know that it was a lighthouse, but there's no pictures of it. In 1859, the second of the lighthouse was built. We'll get into the history of that. That's one of the things that I'm really zeroing in on here. And just below the lighthouse in that area was something called Fishtown, where fishermen lived and had fishing shacks, etc., when the mouth of the Kalamazoo was located there. In 1868, the area where the Sharp Bend is started to be developed, and the Shriver families moved in there and started farming and fishing. In 1870, the government finally coughed up enough money to build some really first-class piers, and we'll see pictures of those. In 1871, the Chicago Fire plus a bunch of other fires started in Wisconsin and Michigan. This had a tremendous effect, as you can imagine, on the demand for lumber. So Singapore boomed, Saugatuck boomed. There were at one time between Saugatuck and Singapore something like 10 mills milling lumber during that time period. Lumber ran out in 1875, unfortunately. So the first section is called The Beginning. There's William Butler. That's his picture, actual photograph taken from a glass plate, scanned by me. This isn't really the boat that brought him and his family, but I think it's fairly close to what has been described as that boat. So it was a pretty small boat, just dropped the family off, and he was on his own. This is the way it would have looked if an eagle had flown over when William Butler got dropped off in 1830. As you can see, the river just winds around there and comes out on the upper left. This is an 1873 map of Singapore, but it sort of shows what it might, some of the landowners. Singapore is at that bend in the river that is closest to the lake. This is just zooms in on that. You can see Singapore was platted to be a sort of a major city. It never quite turned out to be that. Okay, so investors in the New York, Michigan company had big ideas, and the gentleman that was president of that company, his name was O'Shea Wilder, drew up this map and platted it out, and their plan was to have a lot of streets and a lot of houses, and the lots were 90 feet deep by 20 feet, 25 feet wide, and the company was building a sawmill on the shore, which is right in this area here. So that was 1833. This is some details of Mr. Wilder's notes. Let's jump ahead over the next 30 years. Singapore was basically a lumbering mill site. The big business was, the only business was milling lumber. And there were always at least one or two, mostly two sawmills going at the same time. There isn't any accurate record exactly how many mills there were. There were different owners, but as the years passed by, eventually the two owners that you see at the bottom here, Stockbridge and Johnson, acquired the milling rights and the property and much of the surrounding property. And so they were really the big name, and they were located both in the Saugatuck area and Singapore. They had a mill at where Coughlin Park is today, was their first mill in Saugatuck. They had that mill, and then they built mills in Singapore. These two gentlemen were extremely interesting and capable people. I'll talk a little bit about them as we go along. First one was Otis Russell Johnson, who was first really a maker of tanner. He came to Saugatuck he was in his 20s, and he opened a tannery, and then he got into the lumber business, and he was in combination with his father-in-law, whose name was Wells. They were both tanners and lumberers. Then he teamed up with Francis Brown Stockbridge, who was primarily interested in lumber. They were both entrepreneurs. They became lumber barons. Eventually, they sold their interest when the trees ran out in 1875. They sold their interest, and Stockbridge here went into politics. He was a state representative. He was a U.S. senator from they sold everything in 1875. Both left the area at that point. Johnson went to Racine, Wisconsin, family, however, stayed in the lumber business, and actually they started some very substantial lumber businesses in California. He didn't himself, but his sons did. They are still in business out there. Francis Brown became a U.S. Senator and served until his death in the late 1800s and early 1900s. He was also very instrumental in Mackinac Island. He owned a lot of land up there, and he actually owned the land at the Grand Hotel, which sits up there today. He owned that land, and he wanted to build a hotel on it. He eventually got some partners, railroad company that had a lot of capital, but he approved the design of the Grand Hotel before it was built, and owned part of the company that operated the Grand Hotel. He also was involved with the Arnold family, who had one of the ferry services over there. You may recognize that name, the Arnold name. Going back to Singapore, there really wasn't a whole lot in Singapore. The big house and the mills were the most substantial things. There were a bunch of smaller houses, but I don't think the population was ever more than about 100 during the heyday. And people really did not want to live there. They built houses in Saugatuck and they built houses in the hinterland, but they really didn't build a whole lot of houses in Singapore itself.
Jack, just a comment. We're noticing we're having some difficulty hearing. Perhaps if you can just be sure not to drop your voice off, so people aren't straining, because we're losing some of the things that you're saying.
Okay. Maybe it may be better. Can you hear me better now if I sit closer to the microphone?
Yes. Yeah, that helps. That helps. Thanks.
Okay. So I'll kind of stay in this position. One problem that I'm having is, let's see if I can minimize. Singapore had what was known as a wildcat bank from 1837 to 1838. So this is one of the currency that the wildcat bank, this particular one, Singapore, was able to print, and it didn't have very wide acceptance and was not accepted beyond the local area, and eventually went out of existence. But it did have a wildcat bank. In this shot, you can see Singapore in the background up around the corner. So this is taken from Shriver's Bend, looking down the river towards where Singapore was, and you can see a mill building and you can see some ships and piles of lumber there. But this and the previous picture of the mill are the only two pictures that exist of Singapore. This is a little bit closer up shot of that, what I was just talking about. You can see the ships, you can see the mast, you can see the mill, you can see the piles of lumber, but you don't see many houses. Eventually, after 1875, what houses were there, a lot of them were actually moved up to Saugatuck itself. On the ice during the winter, Some of the other houses were just dismantled, but I don't think many were ever really left there, with the exception of the big house, which we looked at the picture of. This is a picture of a cottage that was built there by the Bennett family. We'll get into that later. Or it was built by the Cook family, I'm sorry. There's a picture of me standing on what was once the shoreline of Singapore. And you see those are called wooden slabs, which were used to reinforce the shoreline to keep it from eroding. And in that particular year, which was 1952, there was real high water and it washed back into the dune that exists there. Now today that's all flat land, and it was covered over when the owner at that point decided to extend his land a little bit. That was Frank Denison. When Singapore shut down, the mill was dismantled and taken up to St. Ignace and went into business up there. But they just sold both owners at that point. Just sold all the equipment, and everything that moved went to St. Ignace. These are some photos of what the river mouth looked like in its original state. At one point, the lighthouse light was moved out to the end of the pier. That's what you see here. You see that there's a walkway going out to light at the end of the pier. That's the way the light looked. Unfortunately, a vessel ran into the pier and the lighthouse and damaged it, so they moved it back to on top of the lighthouse. This is what the government piers looked like in 1870, 1871. The government built new piers, which were really quite substantial compared to what had been there before. This is the lighthouse. This is Fishtown in this area. There's another view of the pier. Here's a better view of what Fishtown was like. Now this would have been in about 1870. The fish shacks were here. This is the lighthouse. Another close-up. History of the lighthouse. There were 4 different keepers of the lighthouse. The first 2 served about the first 20 years, and then George Baker was lighthouse keeper until my grandfather became lighthouse keeper in 1909. He was the first professional keeper. His name was George Sheridan. He was born in 1868. His father was a lighthouse keeper on South Manitou Island, which is north. And he was, prior to coming the lighthouse keeper here, he was an assistant keeper in Chicago and in Michigan City. My father was born in the lighthouse in Michigan City. This is the same lighthouse as the previous picture. It had been remodeled in 1899 with new siding and front porch and walkway down to the river, etc. That's my father and his brother and their cousin sitting on the front steps. In 1905, this is what it looked like. you see along the pier here, oh, I need to do that. You see along the pier, this material here, this was being used to build what's called the new cut, which we'll come to next. But at this point, this channel was already beginning to fill in. You can see sand here. The lighthouse was decommissioned in 1915 after the new channel opened up and was eventually sold to the Dean family. And this man on the left there is Arthur Dean, who was an architect. He was also involved with Oxbow. This picture is about 1908, and this people is a Sewers family. Sewers family were fishing family, started here, and the two boys, which were actually twins, Frank and Rube, were fishermen in Saugatuck and in much later years. This picture was taken right next to the lighthouse, and that's Fishtown in the background. This is what Fishtown looked like. The bend is down here. There's my grandfather. It's holding my father and my uncle Joe. This is about 1912 in front of the lighthouse. My grandmother was fishing off the dock in front of the lighthouse. Now we come to the demise of the lighthouse. An infamous day, April 3rd, 1956, a tornado somehow formed along the lake shore. First hit the church camp, then came and demolished the lighthouse. Then went off toward Holland and Zealand and killed a number of people there. This is what was left of the lighthouse after the tornado went through. In 1962, the Deems built a cottage using the foundation of the lighthouse. They owned the property, and they were granted permission to build a temporary road to bring the materials in. So that the present cottage that is there was built in 1962. Here's another view of it taken, an aerial view taken from the lake. Second piece of history is, this is what we'll get to in the last portion of the presentation. Well, maybe that's a good point to stop. Have we got any questions so far? No questions?
Nothing yet, Jack.
Okay, I'll keep going.
Okay, thank you.
Kim, I have a question if I may ask.
Oh, go
Yeah,
ahead,
go
Peg.
back to the date slide.
Pardon?
Jack,
Yes.
in the very first scenic shot that you started the program, there was up to the north, almost to the farthest point you could see, what might have been the Holland Lighthouse. Do you know if that is a possibility?
No. The Holland Lighthouse is another 4 or 5 miles to the north.
How far can you see then from Saugatuck to the end of that view?
I would say you can see to where the frontage for the state park is, or where the line between, and maybe, a quarter or half a mile north. of where the property line is between the North Shore development.
Thank
And
you.
so you really can't see much of that. The other thing, you can barely see the Felt Mansion in some of those aerial pictures. I didn't put any in here, but that's about as far as you can see where the Felt Mansion is.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, 1893, the David Cook family begins to acquire area property. I'll talk a little bit about David Cook when we get to him, but he owned a company that published Sunday school materials in Chicago. In fact, they're still in business. They were quite a wealthy family, and they loved this area, and they had a cottage here, and they started to acquire all the property which really we're talking about today. They bought it piece by piece. Some of it were bought with the help of my grandfather, who acted like straw buying it for himself, but he was really buying it for the David Cook family. And we'll talk more about that in a bit here. 1906, the new river channel was created. They started building it in 1905. In 1906, it was opened. 1910, the Oxbow Art Colony started to bring artists to the area. At first, they were not located where they are, but they eventually got there, which we'll talk about them also. And in 1911, the old channel became the old harbor, and it was landlocked on both ends. 1915, the lighthouse closed, and the reason for that was they were able to put a light at the end of the piers on the new, hang on. Hello. Oh, that's one thing I forgot about the phone ringing. Sorry about that. Anyway, let's see. 1915, the lighthouse closed because the government put a light at the end of the new piers, and they no longer needed the lighthouse. The house itself was then just leased to some people from Oxbow until the Deems bought it. That was in 1936. The Deems bought it. 1945, David Cook's estate sold the property to David Bennett. We'll talk about that. Franklin Denison bought the property from the estate of David Bennett. Frank died in 2000. Audrey McClendon bought the property. Land Conservancy bought the south half. We'll talk about all that in more detail here. Oh, here's some of the details. This is a photo of them digging what's called the new cut. You can see they built the piers at the same time they cut through the distance from the riverbed out to the lake, and that created a much straighter channel that took that loop out. Another shot of the same thing. This allowed some substantial sized vessels like this. There was a great business in those days bringing folks from Chicago to the big pavilion. People would come over for a week, 2 weeks. The way to get here was by ship. So that was the heyday of the tourist business and the shipping business. And a shot of the same thing. Okay, let's go into the details of Oxbow. This is where Oxbow is located, right in here, and there's a number of buildings. Most of them are covered in the trees here, but you can see this is the bend in the river, and this is why it's called Oxbow. Another view taken from, there's a high ridge overlooking Oxbow itself. There's the remnants of the 1870 government pier. There's the crow's nest. And Singapore was down here in this area. In about, I don't recall the exact time, around the beginning of, or the end of the 1800s, this hotel was built here because a lot of ships would come drop off passengers at this point, who would then be taken by wagon over to the Saugatuck Ferry and cross the river at that point. That way the ships didn't have to come all the way down the river to drop off people. These two people, Frederick Fersman and Walter Clute, were the founders of Oxbow, and they were both artists. They both started coming here about 1910 and painting and staying at the Bandel Farm, which is where R.J. Peterson owned. R.J. died recently, but the building where he lives, for those of you who know about that, is where they started their painting. They liked the area and encouraged more painters to come, and grew into the Oxbow School of Art by 1914-15. The hotel business at the Curve, of course, had disappeared because the river route changed, and Fersman and Clute were able to buy the hotel and the property and start the Oxbow School of Art. This is taken 1940s, shows you some of the artists. Looks like a well-organized class. They are painting this subject right here. Some of the really interesting buildings, some of these were ice houses on the river channel. This is got a chuckle out of me. Wallace Kirkland, who I have actually met him, he was a photographer for Life magazine, and he would come every summer and spend some time at Oxbow and take a lot of pictures of women scantily or not dressed at all. It was his specialty. Anyway, somebody put together this spoof. There's Wallace. Apparently he liked VAT 69 because he's getting a transfusion while he's painting a young lady. Okay, David Cook. That's David in the very middle. His wife Marguerite is the woman on the left. This is David. His wife Marguerite. His family, there's 3 generations in this photo. The David Cook family built all these cottages. You see, you can just barely see them, or see some of them quite well in this picture. And there was one up on top here, and I believe that the one up on top here was the one that I showed you the photo of, where it was being buried by sand. But then eventually the Cooks built the Cook Mansion, which was further east on the river, overlooking the river, and on the edge of Singapore. The next owner of the property, when it was sold, actually David Cook died in the early 30s, and his wife kept the property, but it was sold eventually to David Bennett. David Bennett was a very interesting character. He was very wealthy. He owned a business in Chicago that sold perfume. It was called the Burley Company. And he was quite notorious because he had a lot of friends in Washington that got him special favors. And at the end of World War II, he donated or gave as gifts to a number of VIPs in Washington freezers. And this was found out by the press and became quite a scandal. David Bennett and the freezer scandal. He came over here using this. This is not his plane, but this is the kind of plane he had. He would fly right in and land by the pavilion. That was one of the ways he got here. And he also came on the Bennett and his yacht, Valerie. That's docked down in Singapore. Property next was sold to Frank Denison. Frank Denison is a very interesting person in many, many ways. His father was a assistant attorney general for the state of Illinois. His father was the highest ranking black officer in World War I. And Frank inherited some money from his father's family and got into the boat business in 1946 in Florida. There was a lot of business down in Florida building boats for the Navy, wooden boats actually, to begin with, and that morphed into building luxury yachts. He established a plant up in Singapore to build these yachts. These two, I know, were built here. He still continued to build yachts in Florida. Another example. There's the crew, and there's the yacht coming out the door. The plant up here was located right here. As you can see, this is the channel. This is the site of Singapore. The boat building went on here, and in those days you would often see a yacht being finished off and moored in that location right there. Here's an example of some of the boats he built. The first one he actually built was, and before or just after he got the business in Florida, was this one right here, which is a wooden. Most of these hulls, or all of these hulls, were made of aluminum. The yachts were quite luxurious. This picture of Frank. He was quite a guy. Picture of Frank and R.J. Peterson. Now R.J. Peterson had a boat called River Queen. They were small houseboats built in Saugatuck in a plant that he had, which was near the corner of Center Street and Ferry Street. Frank and R.J. Peterson were good friends. property was then sold to Aubrey McClendon. Aubrey McClendon was quite a wheeler dealer. He was in the oil and gas business. He made a lot of
It's
money.
2 o'clock.
At one time, he was the largest private landowner in the country, owning something like 1 million acres of property. His wife was from St. Joe, and she was related to Freddie Upton, and they were connected to the Whirlpool family people. So he was well connected there. On his mother's side, the governor, whose name was Kerr of Oklahoma, was also related to him.
Jack, your voice is trailing off again.
Okay, I'll try and talk a little bit louder. How's that?
Much better, thanks.
There's a picture of Aubrey with a relative of his wife's, model Kate Upton. He was, in addition to being in the oil and gas business, which was his primary business, he also invested, had a lot of side ventures. One of them was buying what is the North Shore property and the Saugatuck Wild Area property when it was put up for sale in the early 2000s by the Denison family. He we're talking about him. The story that I'm told is that he and his wife were taking a boat ride one day up here from St. Joe. He saw the property, said, "I'm going to buy that property," and he did, and he paid $39 million for it. Well, he wanted to develop the property, and there were a lot of people in this community who didn't want it developed. And so a fight ensued, and they tried to get money to buy it and turn it into a park or an area that would never be developed. Well, eventually, they were able to get the south half of the property. That is now the Saugatuck Natural Area. They bought it from Aubrey McClendon for about $19 million. That's why we have what is there today. The north side was still retained by McClendon. McClendon got into some big trouble with the federal government. They accused him of rigging oil leasing bids, etc. And he was indicted by them on charges of doing this. The day he was indicted, he died in an automobile accident. Some people say it may have been suicide, but it was never known exactly. But when Aubrey died, then his estate put the north half of the property up for sale, and that was bought by Jeff PADNOS of Holland, the PADNOS family. And they have spent about 5 years trying to get all the permits to develop it. A big part of the development, we'll go ahead here. Let me bounce back to another family is the Dean family that owned the lighthouse. Norm Dean and his wife Connie were friends of mine. I know them well. They're both, Connie has died in the last couple of years. And Norm lives in California, but he usually comes out here. That's their father on the right, Art Dean. Lighthouse. These folks are all the Dean family and friends, neighbors. They all lived or connected with the Oxbow Lagoon. Here's delivering a new Dean piano to the lighthouse via canoe. Okay, back to PADNOS. Jeff PADNOS bought the property from the McClendon estate for, I'm not sure of the amount, it was probably in the 20 to $30 million range. I believe that they are going to make the best use possible of the land. It's relatively low density. What you see here is the property. It's behind this white line. And they have built some houses right here. One, this house belonged to Denison, up in the corner. That was built in the 1990s, but they have built a few more houses here. But the big part of this plan, as proposed by the PADNOS family, is to build a yacht basin, which is this blue area. And they are still awaiting the final permits. I think they're about 95% done with getting the permits, but they need to get permits from the Corps of Engineers, and my understanding is that's what they're waiting on at this point. But this is the area, and the area around it will consist of home lots. So you can have a big yacht and a big home. And that's the way they're going to make their profit on the property. The rest of it, most of the rest of it, it will not be developed. It will be part of a nature conservative area, conservancy type area. So I'm hopeful that they'll get the permits, proceed with the whole thing, and they deserve to be successful. This is where they are at this point. This is the Denison house that was built here, which is, by the way, it's for sale now if you can afford it. Here's a couple houses that they have built. The yacht basin will be down here in this rendering. Some of their selling points. Asking price 8.2. It's built about 1996. That is this house right here, and that sits right next to the channel. It's just to the right. Of course, the beach is to the front. There's that same slide I showed you before. This is the area right here. This is their picture showing here's where Singapore was, and here's where they proposed to put the yacht basin, and actually Denison's manufacturing building for boats was right here. Here's the river. The lake is just to this side, and the river goes that way, so Saugatuck is over here, just to orient yourselves. Picture of Jeff PADNOS, the current owner, developer. PADNOS, as most of you know, is a great company that is doing business in scrap metals, various kinds of materials that are recycled. That's the end, except I got a postscript left. As a bagpiper, I play many gigs. Recently, I was asked by a funeral director friend to play at a graveside service for a homeless man. He had no family or friends, so the service was to be at a pauper's field cemetery in the Kentucky backcountry. As I was not familiar with the backwoods, I got lost. And being a typical man, I didn't stop for directions. I finally arrived at dusk, an hour late, and saw my funeral friend had evidently gone, and the hearse was nowhere in sight. Only the digger crew was left. I felt badly and apologized to the men for being late. I went to the side of the grave and looked down. The vault lid was already in place. I didn't know what else to do, so I started to play. The workers put down their shovels and gathered around. I played out my heart and soul for this poor man. I played like I've never played before for this homeless man. As I played Amazing Grace, I began to weep. The workers wept. I wept. We all wept together. When I finished, I packed up my bagpipes and started for my car. Though my head hung low, my heart was full. As I opened the door to my car, say, sweet mother, I've never seen nothing like that before. And I've been putting in septic tanks for nearly 20 years. That's all. Now, any questions?
Oh, Jack, we had a question about how and why Oxbow is called Oxbow. And then one additional person made a comment that it's because Oxbow is a crescent-shaped lake lying alongside a winding river. Is that correct about how Oxbow got its name?
There is one shot there that shows the river forms the curve of an oxbow. And apparently that is a fairly common term for a winding river where it makes kind of a C shape. It shows on that, let me see if I can go back. See that. I'll show you.
And then while you're looking for that, do you know what the name of the artist was at Oxbow painting from the hammock?
What was the question again?
If you know the name of the artist at Oxbow who was painting from the hammock.
Rob, you mean?
You'd probably have to go back to that Oxbow picture where they're painting.
Okay, I'll do that. I'm right there anyway. Okay, so this one kind of shows the oxbow. See this slide?
Yep.
Okay, see how it makes sort of like an open C?
Yeah.
That's where the name comes from, oxbow.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so the man painting, Wallace Kirkland. What was
Okay.
the question?
If you knew the name of that artist that's painting there.
Yes, that is Wallace Kirkland.
Okay.
He was quite a famous photographer for Life magazine, and he would come to Saugatuck in the summers. I used to work for the Simonson Photo Studio, and we developed black and white photos for people. That was their business. Well, Wallace didn't have any. He would take a lot of pictures at Oxbow, and we would do the developing of those pictures. So I got to meet him when he would come in there, and I also got to see the pictures, which were at age 16 quite interesting to me. Of the female anatomy.
I bet. He was a Renaissance man, no doubt. Okay,
Yeah.
Also a question about if you know how much of the property PADNOS designated as natural area.
I think there's a total of 270 acres. So it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 acres or so is a natural area. Most of it is. It's just the area along the Lake Michigan shoreline, plus those lots around the yacht basin, which there will be 23 building sites there. So very little of it really is high density, or there's no high density. that's what McClendon wanted, to put a lot of high density stuff there. He wanted about a 6 or 8 story hotel building, I don't know, golf course, that kind of stuff. Well, PADNOS does not want to do that. He respects the area, and he is hopeful that he will recover his investment by making it an exclusive area with the yacht basin will be part of it.
Very interesting. Okay, another question is, we have a House member who visited Singapore back in 1978, and Denison showed them a building with artifacts of the buried city of Singapore. She's wondering if those were saved.
No, I don't know that they were. I do know that the PADNOS people, which includes, they have an arrangement with Cottage Homes. I'm not quite clear on exactly whether Cottage Homes has an equity interest in it, or they're just going to be one of the builders.
Mhm.
But anyway, they had to go through a bunch of digging down into the area where they're going to build the yacht basin to see if there were any artifacts there. And they came up with some shards of pottery and pieces, but there was nothing significant. They didn't come under any buildings or anything like that. So, you know, sounds like Denison may have had stuff that was used in the area, you know, like personal possessions, that kind of stuff, as opposed to being something that was really part of Singapore.
Okay. I have another question, wondering if you know how local citizens feel now about use of the Denison property.
I think, I don't really know. I don't really know. I can't really, I mean, it would be very nice if somebody had come up with $20 million and bought the property and said, well, it's just going to stay the way it is. But you know, they had that opportunity, and they did come up with enough to buy the south half. There's a lot of people that would like to see it undeveloped, but there's also a lot of people, let's be realistic, that this would be a very good thing for the community. Will bring in a lot of well-heeled folks to have homes there.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I would guess if you took a vote, it would be strongly for what is being done.
Okay. And then there's a comment that the Dunes Alliance is against the development, which makes sense if it's near a dune area. Another question is, what year was the last time the top of the big building in Singapore was last seen before it was covered by sand?
That was the late 1890s. And actually, there's a story about that. There was a gentleman, his name was Raymond Nees, and who he and another friend had walked to Holland and came back, and they were cold, and it was apparently in the winter, and there was part of the roof sticking up, and they built a fire to warm themselves, and it kind of got away from them and burned the top of that building off.
Oh.
So that may have been, well, what Raymond Nees said was that was the last of Singapore. But the sand has moved around there a lot, and there really isn't any significant or anything really of the buildings left.
Okay. All right, that's all I have. If anyone else wants to unmute themselves to ask a question or make a comment, please feel free to do so now.
Jack, this is Randall. Would you go back to the photos of R.J. Peterson? For those of you who don't know, R.J. passed away just a few months ago, and he was a legend in Saugatuck, and be nice to see what just to focus on him just for a moment before we say goodbye. So there's R.J. Very good.
Wow.
Yeah, he owned the marina in Douglas, and big operation there and was renowned in Saugatuck Douglas for sure.
Well, R.J. Peterson was a entrepreneur type guy. He was a businessman. He was in business, and his father started this River Queen business in Michigan City, in that area where they lived. His father was a retired guy from the steel company that was there. Anyway, they moved the business to Saugatuck, and there was a huge building. It was called the Harding Hotel. It was on the corner of Center Street and Ferry Street, and they bought that building and they built River Queens there for 10, 15 years. Eventually, the business was sold to a corporate business that ran it into the ground. But that's what this picture is. They're in a River Queen. RJ did an awful lot for the community. He was really a great guy, and we really miss him.
And another question came in there. I don't know, Kim, if you saw it, but someone's asking Jack, why exactly did Singapore disappear?
Singapore disappeared because we ran out of trees upriver. The trees were all cut upriver and floated down river. And eventually, and the big tree, of course, was the white pine tree. And were floated down river. Well, they ran out of enough logs that were close to the river to cut. And that's why they moved north. There was more logs up there. That was really the only thing that kept Singapore going were the mills. It was a little mill town, but it really wasn't much of a town. It's kind of a misnomer to say, well, it had a bank. Well, the Wildcat Bank wasn't really very substantial. There really wasn't anything going on there except the people that lived there that worked in the mills.
And why was the name changed to Saugatuck?
You mean why is Saugatuck not named Singapore?
Right.
Well, no, there's some dispute as to why it's even called Saugatuck because there were other names, and I don't think that the first settler, Mr. Butler, named it Saugatuck when he came here. It had other names.
It was named Kalamazoo at one time.
It was named Newark. Newark, I think, was the name that was recognized immediately preceding Saugatuck. I think that Butler had something to do with the name Saugatuck because he came from Connecticut, and the only other Saugatuck is out in Connecticut.
Ah.
So that's where the name comes from.
Interesting. Okay.
Now, a bigger historical question is, where does the name Singapore come from? Nobody knows that. I mean, why was it named Singapore? Obviously, they know there was a Singapore, and I'm sure that's where the name Singapore comes from. But why was that name used to name this Hope for town, Singapore? Nobody knows.
Are there any other questions?
I'll make a statement. R.J. Peterson owned the Keewatin,
Yes.
which he sold, and they moved it up to Canada on Lake Huron, and now it's for sale again. Evidently, it didn't fly in Huron for sale.
Right.
Well, the story on that is the boat has been, it's over $1 million has been restoring the boat. The problem is where it was docked. There was the people that owned the property where it was docked decided they didn't want the Keewatin there, docked at their property. So they're trying to find another place for it. It's a great tourist attraction. I'm sure they'll find something, but that's the problem. It's not in the boat. It's in a place to dock it and basically show it off. I mean, it's been wonderfully restored. Wow.
Kim, when will this be available for HASP members to go back and maybe move through the slides if they choose to do so? Is it available online?
Yeah, so I usually get a notice from Zoom a little later, a couple hours later after the presentation that the video is ready, and then I load it to the HASP YouTube page, which we've been setting the videos to be public to HASP members on December 14.
Okay, great.
I'm sorry that I'm really not used to this kind of a presentation. You know, I mean, I'm used to showing it, talking about the slides and the pictures and what I know about that. So putting the whole thing together was something I got to learn better, I guess.
Well, Jack, we all we appreciate the presentation and your slides. I mean, I've seen a lot of slides of the area, but obviously this is you shared a wealth of photographic material here that I'd not seen before. I'm sure that's true of the others participating in the class today. So thank you so very much. We really appreciate the time and energy that you put into this. And it was very, very enlightening. I certainly know for one that I learned a lot. Does anybody have anything else before we close?
You guys did a great job. It was a wonderful education. Thank you so much.
Thanks for your help too, Dave.
Yes.
Sure.
Okay.
Thing I would like people to take away is an understanding of the various parts of this. I mean, they're all wonderful. I mean, it's a beautiful area. It has a very interesting history, and there's a story behind, you know, why it is what it is today. But it's really very unique.
Rich history, and it's delightful to have someone like you share it, Jack, with such a good knowledge of it. And you know, for anybody who has not been out there, I mean, one of the great ways to see it is to take that Star of Saugatuck cruise when it's available, because you really get a nice view of many of the things that Jack talked about today.
Great.
Dave,
Thank you
what
so
about-
much, Jack. You did a good job. Can check this off your to-do list now. And Jack, I'll send you
Thank
the
you
link
for
when it's ready, okay?
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much. Goodbye, everyone. Have a great afternoon and enjoy the sunshine today.
All right. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Kim.
Thanks, Randall. Bye-bye.
You bet. Bye.